Welcome to another episode of Whitetail Rendezvous, coming to you 6 days a week as we interview whitetail experts and hear their traditions and personal stories of the hunt. Learn more about the latest gear, discover proven tips, and the latest strategies so you can make your next hunt a success. Now, here's your host, Bruce Hutchin.
Welcome to Josh Honeycutt, deer hunting editor at realtree.com. And this is the end of a three-part series that you can listen to from Josh. The first we talked about August prep, then early season in September. And now we're going to talk about his favorite time during a rut. Everybody loves to hunt the rut. It's a great time to see bucks. So, Josh, let's jump into it.
Yeah. The rut, that's what everybody talks about. It's what everybody loves. I will say it's not my favorite time of year to hunt, but my favorite time of year to hunt is the early season. And my second favorite time to hunt is the pre-rut. My third time is probably late season, and then the rut's probably my worst favorite, or my least favorite. But, I'm not saying the rut's bad. I just have my own personal thoughts about the rut and reasons why I prefer to hunt outside of the rut. But I still do hunt during the rut. And I will say, as far as action goes, there's no better time than the rut. The chasing, all the breeding activity, the fighting, everything that revolves around or plays in as a factor during the rut is cool and it's fun to see. But if you're trying to target one specific deer, as I commonly and generally do, the rut's oftentimes, especially the peak rut, is the worst time to try to do that. So I call the rut, in my mind, the unprepared hunter's crutch. Because, the rut, and I've done it myself, I've killed a lot of deer during the rut, and the rut's a great time to do it. And that's probably the time that deer, obviously we know from research that the rut is when a buck is most willing to get up and move during daylight. Daylight activity actually increases throughout the summer, throughout the early season, leading all the way up to the peak of the rut. So we know a deer, even mature deer, is most willing to move in daylight during the rut, and that's great. But if you are patterning a deer and you're spending all this time figuring out where they bed, where they feed, what trails they use, that all kind of goes out the window once the rut starts and things change. And instead of that bedding right there in that bedding area, he's bedding in all year long. Now he's bedding a little in different places. He's leading up to the rut. He's, spending time, instead of going from that, using those trail networks that he used to get from bed to feed all year long that you've been patterning and covering and scouting. Now he's different. He's using different trails. He might be using trails that takes him through doe bedding areas, looking for that first hot doe as he swings around, heads over to the cornfields. Things just different. So I do prefer to hunt outside of the rut. But when it comes to the rut itself, some people refer to it as seeking and chasing and tending. If I had to choose one of those three, I would probably choose that period where it's right around the end of the pre-rut leading into the very, very beginning of that seeking phase. Because to me, that's whenever you're going to see the most and best daylight activity, with also a little bit of pattern still left, so to speak. So
to you, the pre-rut starts?
Well, to me, for us here, what I consider the pre-rut is usually starts somewhere around October 15th in my mind, the pre-rut, and you can break it down differently however you want. But I kind of look at it early season from the beginning of September until about, that second week of October. And then when you get toward the middle of October, it kind of shifts over to that pre-rut. Basically when all the bucks are in their fall ranges. That's whenever the majority of your bucks are where they're going to be and they're in their fall range. That's whenever I kind of make it that shift from, okay, it's changed from early season to pre-rut now. And so that's my favorite period to hunt. Or second favorite, my favorite's early season. My second favorite's pre-rut. But, from say probably October 15th, just to throw a date out there, October 15th until about November 1st, November 2nd, those first couple days of November is what I consider pre-rut. Then you start seeing quite a bit more bigger differences. You see a little bit more movement further from those bedding areas, in different places than they were before. But I'd say it's probably about a 2-week window, maybe a little bit more, that I consider the pre-rut.
And folks, that changes a little bit depending on where you are in the country, just a little bit. Want to become a smarter deer hunter? Know when to hunt, where to hunt, how to hunt? Well, Deer Hunting Institute Part 1 was created to do exactly that, because many people have told me they struggle with spending all days in the woods and never seeing a deer, only shooting does and young deer, leaving the woods empty-handed way too many times. Found this wonderful, but just couldn't get on them, having difficult finding a place to hunt, recognizing possible mistakes you're making every year, having tried and failed to find qualified mentors who deliver results. If you had these frustrations or struggles, go to deerhuntinginstitute.com, and there you'll find a 13-module course to help you solve these problems. Again, go to deerhuntinginstitute.com and find some answers. Josh, what are some of the signs that you see the rut starting to kick in gear?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that you can pay attention to. If you see a sudden increase in scrapes, a sudden increase in rubs, there's a lot of signs out there. If you're still patterning deer, maybe you've got some cell trail cameras out, there's some cellular trail cameras, or if you're checking trail cameras, traditional cameras, and you see a sudden change in a mature deer or other deer bucks that you've been following, say you've been following them for a couple of weeks, say you start, from October 10th to October 30th, you had, that deer doing a pretty consistent thing. And then boom, on the very end of October, beginning of November, you see a sudden change and he's not doing it now. Well, that's a sign that, you're kind of transitioning into the rut. You can also watch actual whitetail behavior. Like if you're in the tree stand and you see like a doe that's acting pretty squirrely, or she's got her tail stuck straight out, or she's peeing a lot, or, there's different subtle behaviors that does especially will make that suggest that they're nearing estrus. Now, most of the bulk of the breeding, at least where I'm at, doesn't happen until around November 10th to 20th. And it's going to be pretty much a peak window that's about 2 to 3 days, somewhere between those two dates. And it's kind of different, a little bit different from year to year. But the big window, at least from our area, is about November 10th to 20th. And then you're going to have a 2 day window, 2 to 3 day window within that bigger window where the biggest portion of the breeding is actually going to take place. So as you get closer and closer to that window, you can start to really analyze the deer behavior. And you'll see, especially with does, you'll see that you can tell when one's in estrus. As far as bucks go, if those tarsal glands are getting really dark, if they're getting a lot heavier staining on them, that's a sign that you're getting closer and closer. During the peak ruts when you're going to see probably the peak staining. Maybe right after the rut, you'll see peak staining. But yeah, that's a few things that you can look at.
And just to mention, testosterone is up high. So a big deer looks like he's a linebacker for the Green Bay Packers. I mean, he's just huge up front. And, you can see that in transition if you have trail cameras or you're watching the deer. You're not hunting the deer, you're just watching the deer, and you can watch that. The other tip is that accident reports start going up, during the chasing and the sneaking phase. And all you have to do is read the accident reports in your newspaper or just Google it, how many accidents, because unfortunately...
Just take a drive down the interstate.
Really, and that's a great indicator for your area to do it. I know last fall, I don't like to drive at night during the deer season or the rut, and a deer literally ran into the side of my truck. He just ran square into the middle side of the truck, and I'm going, yikes. And, I had to get it repaired. But, saying that, all this information Josh is sharing about the rut, you can figure it out yourself. In the last episode, I said about keeping a journal. And if you want to be a 365 hunter and really figure out what the deer are doing in your neighborhood, you got to start writing things down, because you go, oh, yeah, I'll remember that. Well, I can guarantee you won't. But if you have a journal, you go, the weather was this, the activity was this, and the trail camera images were given this. So there's 3 separate things, and all of a sudden you start putting together and you see patterns. And then, just like Josh has said, he'll select a deer that he wants to hunt. Another deer comes through, and it's a deer that gets him excited. He's going to shoot it. But you have to really learn and become a student of the game. And Josh and I on the off time and talked about that a little bit. You've really got to be knowledgeable about what the deer is doing, why they're doing it, and when they're doing it. Yeah. So let's just go through the different phases of the rut and the basic activities of what that buck is doing and a doe is doing during each one of those phases.
Yeah, so one thing I do want to say before we jump into it, I think it's a good segue, is, when you're looking at especially trail camera data, oftentimes unless you use a cellular trail camera, you're checking those cameras during the rut. By the time you check them, it's no longer relevant because everything is in such small windows during the late October and throughout November. So unless you're checking trail cameras 2 or 3 times every 2 or 3 days, which you shouldn't do that, the information that you get from your cameras during the rut is almost irrelevant by the time you check. I really check cameras during the season is when I go in to hunt a stand. And if I'm not hunting that stand or that farm or that area, I still only check those cameras about once a month. So with that information in mind, we're talking about dates earlier. We're talking about kind of the windows for the pre-rut, windows for the early season, windows for the rut. Obviously, I don't have the dates for everybody and for every state, but something that you can do if you run trail cameras throughout the season is go back and look at past years. A buck is going to hit his peak weight and his peak muscular frame and his peak toughness look, so to speak, right at the tail end of the pre-rut, at the beginning of the seeking phase, so to speak, when deer really start moving and looking. So for me, that's generally around October 30th, right around October 30th or so, kind of between October 30th and November 2nd, 3rd. That's whenever a deer is going to hit his peak weight around here. And that's when he's going to be the most muscular and most built up and beefed up. After that, the bucks kind of start eating less. They start running a lot more. They end up covering a lot more ground, and they start losing weight. So for you guys out there, anybody who might be listening, if you don't already know when it kind of switches over from the pre-rut to the rut in your area, just go back and look at your trail camera pictures from past years. And if you have a specific bucks that you've followed or had pictures of from summer or early season all the way through the rut into the late season, you're going to be able to look at those body mass and body weights and see kind of when these transitions are. And you can kind of look, and that way you can have it in your head. You can also call your biologist, your state biologist. They're going to be able to tell you when your peak dates are as well. But that's something that I like to do because ruts can vary slightly from location to location and even farm to farm for that matter.
Do you want to become a smarter whitetail hunter, knowing when to hunt, where to hunt, how to hunt? Over the past 4 years, people have asked me, hey, I'm struggling with spending all day in the woods and never seeing a deer, only getting opportunities at doe or young bucks, leaving the woods empty-handed too many seasons. Located the deer of a lifetime, but just flat out missed. Having difficulties finding a place to hunt, recognizing mistakes that you're making over and over again, and you want to eliminate them. Having tried and failed to find qualified mentors. Well, you come to the right place. Why? Because Deer Hunting Institute Part 1 was created by me, Bruce Hutchin. It's a 13-module course that'll talk about being lost in the deer hunting forest. Never hunted. What is a hunter? What is an adult onset hunter? What rules apply? Finding a mentor, choosing a weapon, finding a place to hunt, scouting a hunt location, stand sites, stand access and exit, reading sign, and when to hunt. All these are available for you at deerhuntinginstitute.com. Go now to deerhuntinginstitute.com and sign up for the best deer hunting course in America.
So let's talk about the chasing phase. And we talked a little bit about the pre-rut. Now let's just break it down and tactics that you use during the seeking phase and chasing phase, tending phase, or lockdown phase, and then the post-rut.
Yeah, so that's how a lot of hunters break it down. And that seeking phase is kind of that period between the pre-rut and when deer actually start coming into estrus. I mean, there might be a few does that enter estrus during that seeking phase. There's not going to be a ton. It's not going to be the bulk of the does. And so during that time, there's actually not a whole lot of breeding that's going on. But that's whenever the bucks, they have the most pent-up stress and most pent-up testosterone. And that's when they haven't really been able to do much breeding yet, if any, but they want to. And their testosterone levels are through the roof. So they end up moving more. They start moving. It depends on the deer. He might still be in some of his old patterns during that, as he did during the latter portion of the pre-rut. So you can still sometimes take advantage of patterns, bed to feed patterns that you saw throughout earlier portions of the season. But that kind of goes away once you get into that chasing phase, or can go away. Every situation is different. And some bucks don't even participate, as the research shows, some bucks don't even participate in the breeding activity. So that's not to say that just because it's the middle of the rut doesn't mean you can't take advantage of a bed to feed pattern that you've been looking at, since beginning of October. It might still happen. And nothing is ever black and white, just shades of gray when it comes to hunting. But, that's something that I like to do whenever you hit that seeking phase, so to speak. I'm still focused on bedding areas. But if I see that that's not being effective, then I'm going to start transitioning a little bit closer to the doe bedding areas. When I really like to transition and start focusing on doe groups is when you get in closer to that chasing phase. And that's somewhere around that November 5th to 10th, somewhere in there. Might be a little bit later, might be a little bit earlier, depending on the year and depending on the place. But once it gets a little bit closer to that chasing phase, that's when I start focusing more on does and less on bucks. And then whenever you get into that tending phase, the breeding phase, where actually the actual breeding takes place, then I'm still focused on does, but I'm going to be focused on pockets of cover where I think the mature buck or bucks that I'm hunting are going to be pushing those doe twos. Because whenever a doe actually enters estrus, more times than not, a big mature buck is going to push that doe where he wants her to go. And if you hunt a property long enough, you can kind of identify where the mature bucks like to push estrus does to get them away from the rest of the herd. So come the peak breeding times, that's what I like to focus on and kind of do. But again, a lot of mature bucks, they don't allow, and when I say mature bucks, I'm talking 5, 6 plus, maybe 4 plus. This doesn't really, I don't really rope in the 2.5 and the 3.5-year-olds into this, and oftentimes not even the 4.5-year-olds, because your 3.5 and 4.5-year-old deer do the bulk of the breeding. But as bucks get ultra mature and mega mature, 5, 6, 7 plus, the research shows that they don't let the rut make them do crazy things. Not to say that they won't or that they don't, because they do. But those mega mature, ultra mature bucks are less apt to let the rut get them killed than a 3.5 or a 4.5 or maybe even a 5.5-year-old deer. So if you're hunting a really, really old mature deer that is a smart deer and he has the type personality that he does not let the rut get to him, so to speak, you might still be able to focus on his bedding areas and capitalize that way.
You said a couple of things, that I hope everybody really takes to heart. One, the buck will push the doe where he wants her to be for, what is it, a 24, 48-hour peak breeding season? I mean, during that time.
Yep.
And so you have to think, when they disappear, people say, oh, they're tending to lockdown, they're actually breeding. You still can hunt them.
Mm-hmm.
And,
you got to get in that bubble.
You just have to really get inside. And one of the best guys that I know, I'm going to give a shout out for Heads Up Decoy, Garrett Rowe. But he does that really well in Kansas. And he gets inside that bubble because, and Josh, you can speak to this, bucks won't leave that doe, will they?
No, they're sticking pretty tight to that wherever that doe goes. And I will say this, it can be hard knowing where deer or where bucks like to push those does. You're a younger buck, a 1.5 years, a 2.5-year-old buck, maybe even a 3.5-year-old buck, they're not going to be as apt to push those does where they want them to go. But those older bucks, those 4.5-plus-year-old bucks, that's it's not their first time on the block. It's not their first time doing this deal. They've learned throughout the years that they can push those does to areas to get them away from other bucks. So if you hunt a property for consecutive years and you've got some history with a property, if you really start to pay attention to that and think in that way and make note of that during the peak rut, you're going to start to see a trend. And properties that I've hunted for, at least 2 to 3, 4 years, even in season, if you really get good daylight sightings and you get enough sample size, you get a big enough sample size, so to speak, it doesn't matter how long you've hunted it, but if you've hunted it consecutive, you'll start to see where those mature deer like to push those does. You can see it based on your trail cameras you got out. You can see it based on, in the field sightings too.
So we've covered a portion of the pre-rut. What about post-rut? Because I know some people that are very successful during the post-rut targeting large mature deer that all of a sudden they need to replenish.
Yeah, based on the record books, you look at the record books, the majority of the true top-end big deer, but the biggest of the big deer, if you just look at the ones that were killed during the rut, now we're not going to include the data from like early season or pre-rut or late season, but if you just look at the big deer that's killed during the rut, most of your really big, really old, mature bucks killed during the rut are killed during the post-rut, which for me is going to be like November 20th to 30th, maybe even the first couple of days of December. And I think there's different reasons for that. But I think, number one, at that point, obviously deer have been pressured. So it's actually kind of surprising that the big deer get killed that late. But I think a big part of it has to do with the fact that those older deer, they know how to play the game. They basically pace themselves, so to speak. They understand that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And whereas those younger bucks, those 1.5, 2.5, 3.5-year-old deer, they don't know that or haven't quite committed it to memory, I guess, because you'll see that their inclusion or involvement in the rut kind of starts to taper off much sooner than your 4.5, 5.5-year-old deer. Even though the 3.5 and the 4.5, maybe even some of the 5.5-year-old deer will do the bulk of the breeding, when you get into the back end of that rut, you see your older deer taking part in kind of finishing that process out. And I don't know why that is. That's just what the research I've looked at and the biologists I've talked to have told me. But I think a lot of it probably has to do with the fact that, well, your 3.5 and 4.5-year-olds, they're going to get killed the first 2 weeks of the season because they're the most daylight active during that period. And that's when most hunters are hunting anyway. You don't have as many hunters hunting that last third of November as you do the first 2/3. But, at the same time, again, I keep going back to it, but I think the biggest reason is those really old deer, those 5.5-plus-year-old deer, they know how to pace themselves throughout, whereas younger bucks don't.
Now, what about the December breeding season? 30 days after estrus, does will cycle through if they haven't been bred, plus the fawns of the year. Some of them, if they had good nutrition and are healthy, they will be able to breed in December, 30 days after the peak breeding season. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what a lot of people refer to as the second rut, or, I think most of that is your young does, your fawns. And the reason I say that is this: buck to doe ratios aren't as bad as most people think they are. It's biologically impossible. And you can ask any deer biologist you want this question. And I'm not one, but you can go, ask your state biologist if you want. I'm not saying you, Bruce, but just any listener out there, if they disagree with me, because I hear it all the time. Oh, well, my buck to doe ratio is like 1-10 or 1-15 or 1-9 or 1-8. It's biologically impossible for that to be the case. Now, I'm talking pre-hunt ratios. Now, pre-season ratios. It is impossible for there to be more than 4 to 5 does per buck. And that's extremely rare for most places. A more common buck to doe ratio is 1-2, maybe 1-3. So with that said, I think the bulk of the does are getting bred during the primary rut in most places. Maybe not everywhere, but in most places, in most situations. Now, obviously, those buck to doe ratios become more skewed throughout the season as people are hunting, and it can be skewed either way. It can be skewed better and closer to 1-1 or further away from 1-1, depending on the location and what the hunters have been doing there. But that's something to think about, because biology tells us that it is impossible for there to be more than 1-4, maybe 1-5 does or bucks to does. And the reason for that is every year the fawn crop basically recorrects the buck to doe ratio. So I think the post-rut is mostly comprised of younger does that got bred. Obviously, there's room for does to get missed. I'm not saying does don't get missed, because they definitely do. I've seen adult does get that breed during the month of December too. So I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I think more times than not, in areas with good habitat, you can have, for this area where we've got a lot of ag, as many as 40 to 50% of the doe fawns can breed their first year at some point during the season or during that winter. Whereas, in areas that's maybe down south, the deep south, it doesn't have as good a habitat and not as good of food sources, you may only see 5 or 10% of the doe fawns, and maybe even lower than that, maybe 2 or 3 or 4% of the doe fawns breeding. But that's kind of my take as far as, the age classes of the doe that actually do the breeding during that second post-rut.
What is your thought on all-day sits?
Yeah, I'll do them. I don't do them all the time. I pretty much restrict all day sits to situations where I know that a buck is moving during that time. And that's my answer outside of the rut. I won't do an all day unless I know that a buck potentially could be moving through there and habitually does that. During the rut, I will do all day sits. I think, a lot of big deer get killed between 10 and 2. So, matter of fact, I've killed deer between 10 and 2. So it's one of those things where if you can sit there, do it. And not everybody can, whether that be physically or because they have time constraints or whatever that might be. But if you can do it, I say go for it. And the reason, there's multiple reasons. Primarily, a lot of deer, like I said, move between 10 and 2. But more than that, it has to do with how much pressure you put on those deer. Because if you go in there once and go out once, that's half as much scent that you leave behind, half the chance of spooking deer, whether versus, you go in early that morning before daylight, and then you come out right before lunch, you go eat something, you come back in right after lunch, and then you leave again after the afternoon hunt. That's 4 entry exit routes there. Whereas if you do an all day sit, it's 2. So you reduce the likelihood of bumping deer by half. You reduce the likelihood of deer catching their ground scent by not maybe half, but you're leaving less ground scent that way. So yeah, I definitely am an advocate for all day sits.
Hey, thanks for listening to the show tonight. Before we go, can I take a moment and say thank you? Listen, as we started the Whitetail Rendezvous podcast journey, we had no idea what to expect. But after 4 years, we received a ton of feedback from our over 400,000 listeners and climbing to 500,000. Speaking of which, we are now closing in on over 600 featured guests. Thank you. And a quick shout out to all those who have left an iTunes review and your feedback. I get those and really appreciate it. And it's awesome to see what you have to say, and we do read every single one of them. And I just want you to know that I am incredibly grateful for your kind words regarding the show. And all of the ratings and reviews help us attract more listeners. And if you're one of those new listeners, welcome. Great to have you. By the way, if you haven't taken the time to rate and review our show and like the Hunting on Private Land strategy on how to get permission to hunt a private property, go to whitetailrendezvous.com as a special gift for just rating and reviewing our show. When you get there, look for the start button to get the details. Listen, I'll share you the top technique from some of the top hunters in the country on how do they get permission to hunt on private land. I'll share with you the exact techniques they use to get permission. As my way of saying thanks for rating and reviewing the show on iTunes. So join us next time. And remember, we're all on this journey together, learning, sharing, and becoming 365 hunters.
One thing I've thought about, done it wrong more times than I've done it right. I'm in a great place. I'm in a actually place I'm thinking of. There's a river to my right. There's a hillside to my left. And it's just a natural funnel. So it's an all-day sit during the rut. I've seen deer all day. And then I know there's deer within 100 yards of me. And now it's pitch black out. How the heck did I get out of there?
Sounds to me like the best entry and exit route for that particular location would be by canoe.
And I would agree.
Yeah. If there's like deer under your tree, typically I like to wait until I think that deer has wandered off before I get out of the tree. And I've stayed in a tree stand 2 hours after dark just waiting for deer to clear. But, it's one of those things where, as far as just the general entry and exit route, if you've got a river or a creek or something like that that's right next to your stand, by far and away, the best way in and out of that place, hands down, bar none, is with a canoe or a kayak or some other non-motorized boat.
Right. And people that I've talked to about that, well, how do I get my deer out if it's not a full-size canoe? It's simple. You can cut them out. You can just leave them and come back in later. Normal entrance and access, from the land, or you can take them out with the canoe. I mean, deer guys do that all the time. And that's one thing we talked when we're offline, you got to think out of the box and you got to figure out, okay, what's the best way to do this? And use topography, use all the things, but you got to think, okay, what's my minimum pressure on these deer and how do I do it best? And that comes down to sometimes, Josh, I'm sure you don't hunt a stand just because everything isn't right. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. Rarely, if ever, will all the conditions line up and be perfect. As like I said last year with the deer that I killed, I was hunting with a just off wind. Sure, I would love to have the wind right in my face, but, that rarely happens. And honestly, I think the odds of seeing mature deer go down whenever the conditions are perfect for the hunter. Whenever the conditions are more in favor or better suited for that deer, I think you're more likely to see them in daylight. Now, we can give deer too much credit maybe, but I do stand, at least my current thought process is that the more conditions are in that deer's favor, the more likely he is to move in daylight hours, especially outside of the rut. But yeah, I will definitely hunt stand locations, even if the situation or conditions aren't perfect. Yeah, definitely.
And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up this 3-part series with Josh Honeycutt, deer hunting editor for realtree.com. Josh, it's always a pleasure to connect with you, and I can't wait to see your pictures from the season and connect with you next winter as we do a recap of 2019.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. And actually, this fall, we'll be filming for the Midwest Whitetails Chasing November. So you can follow all the action there. It's a weekly series, and I'll be contributing all of my hunts and footage each week to that series. And hopefully we'll see some dead deer this fall.
So is that with Bill Winke?
Yes, sir.
So, folks, if you're not a member already, again, the name of the show is Midwest Whitetails. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you can watch the show. You'll have to download the Realtree 365 app, and you'll find the show right there. You can also find it on YouTube and MidwestWhitetail.com.
And if somebody wants to reach out to you, how's the best way to do that, Josh?
I'm on Facebook, Josh Honeycutt, or Instagram, Josh_Honeycutt, and feel free to give me a shout there.
All right. And Realtree.com, just go to there and Google.
Yeah. As far as content, you can go as far as content goes. If you're just wanting to look at some of the content that we have, you can go to Realtree.com. You can also go to MidwestWhitetail.com because I'm contributing a lot of written and video content there as well. So either of those places will get it done.
Well, as always, Josh, it's a pleasure to visit with you, and thanks for your insight today.
Thank you. I appreciate the time. It's always an honor, and good luck to you, and God bless.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for another episode of Whitetail Rendezvous, where you can listen and learn from the experts so you can be more successful on your next hunt. Until next time, listen, learn, and succeed.